Hello, everyone, and welcome to Week 3 of the STC Roundtable. Today's Roundtable panel discussion is presented by Rahel Bailie, Ann Rockley, Jeff MacIntyre, and Heinz Wittenbrink. Rahel, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. Welcome to this deep dive with some of the content strategy experts that I tried to choose from different disciplines and different areas and different geographic locations. And I think we've got a good sampling here. And what's surprising to me is that everyone, I know all three of them personally of our panelists, but they've never met each other. And in our industry that's small, that's almost criminal. So it's my delight to introduce Ann Rockley, who I've probably known the longest of any of these folks, and who I have great admiration for, and she's been one of my mentors over the years. Jeff MacIntyre, who again, I've known for ages and ages, but is in New York and is working with kind of different content strategy than Ann is. And then Heinz Wittenbrink, who is with the university in Graz, Austria, and he's the program director of the content strategy master's program, and does content strategy in his own right. So we've got some expertise from around the world, and of course I'm Rahel Ann Bailie. Helps if I remember my own name. And I'm going to be moderating this panel. So we're going to jump into it right now with our first topic. And that is content operations the logical outcome of content strategy? So I would like to encourage our panelists to speak up, and I'll just give a little bit of context to this, and that we've been talking about content strategy for many, many years, and we know that it's important to have a strategy, which is, a plan, and basically, whoops, why did this go forward? But what we don't have is that, or what we haven't had until recently, is the language and the terminology to explain what we want to get out of the strategy. And over the years, we've used terms like we want to have an integrated content strategy, or we want to have some ROI on our content, or we want to to have some sort of an outcome. But recently, it's kind of the penny dropped for me that we can kind of call all this, kind of roll it up into this term of content operations. We want an operating model for content that will get us the results we want. So, and maybe could you start off and talk a little bit about what you think about this premise that I put forward?
Certainly. So when I think of content strategy, and as you said, a lot of the discussions, we're talking about how to design the content, how to we have many goals with the content, so the customer needs, supporting reuse, optimizing the information, optimizing translation, all sorts of things. But it's a strategy, it's a plan. It isn't the actual activity that is associated with content strategy. So as we look at how do we actually operationalize this, how do we make it happen within the organization, it truly is a logical outcome of content strategy. So when I'm thinking about content operations, what I'm thinking about is sort of the definition that I use. It's a set of processes. It's the people that are involved in those processes. It's the technology. It's the all of the guidelines, the information architecture that you've put together, models, metadata, workflow, et cetera, the customer experience. So it's putting all of that into action. It's operationalizing it and ensuring that we can actually move forward with the strategy. And just one other point, and then we can sort of discuss back and forth. But when we think about content strategy, a lot of people sort of think about it as one and done, and you sort of go off. But really, when content strategy is operationalized, it becomes part of the day-to-day activity, so that you're constantly cycling back to the strategy itself, revisiting it, determining how to optimize it, and then pushing it through to the actual usage and delivery within the organization.
Interesting. Jeff, what's your take on content operations as a logical outcome of a content strategy?
Well, judging from my vociferous reaction, my neck has been springing my head back and forth as Ann talks. So I think we're in violent agreement.
Okay.
A lot of this comes down to accountability. I work as a consultant, as I know a number of us do, and there is an ever increasing focus, I think, on organizations, even those that take content as a business asset very seriously, that nevertheless we need to get a better view on the return on investment, whether that's internal rates of return or how these assets are performing in the wild. And it's exactly as Ann says it. A strategy is simply a plan for getting from point A to point B. And really the sort of lived value in operations is where I find most of the pain is. And ultimately strategy is easy, operations is hard. And I think we're just looking at a closer, higher degree of accountability than in the past, in part because, and I know we'll talk about this later, the tools are so much better than they have ever been before. So we have a lot more reckoning with exactly how our assets and our offerings are performing.
Interesting. So many years ago, James Matthewson, I saw him at a conference, and he was sitting at lunch, and we were talking, and he said something to me that really stuck with me for many years, and that was that how did he say? He said, you can have a better operational model. He didn't use these words, but it came down to you have a better operational model. So, you save $3 million. It costs you $3 million to put it in. Nobody cares. They're not going to go there. But you miss a sale and then watch them jump into action. So he always had that focus on let's get ROI to content, and probably accurately so, that that kind of helping the internal people be able to operationalize their content better. There just wasn't a recognition of it. And so for me, that change to say, if you want to get really good results on the front end, you have to fix the back end first, is it's kind of a welcome change in the industry, where people are starting to understand that just like there's a value to DevOps, there's also a value to content ops. Heinz, we haven't heard from you yet. So what are your thoughts on operationalizing content, and has this taken off in the kind of Austrian, German areas of practice yet?
Yeah, what I can say, I've just read a project work of one of our students related to content operations, and it's a very interesting example. It's for a website which is a kind of showcase for Vue.js, the JavaScript framework, and I think they have more than 1,000 different examples of implementations. And the question of this paper is, how can we decide which of all these different pages have to be updated regularly? And then she does a content audit with the questions: what are the can we construct a kind of algorithm saying these are the things we have to be the most attentive to, and she succeeds in doing it. And I would say that's a typical content operations question. That's not content strategy. The strategy is existing before, but here you have something that has to be repeated every day, that belongs to the implementation, and that is a kind of project field on its own. I think that's very interesting.
I remember reading that, actually. I remember reading her. Oh, no, she was presenting in class. That's right. I remember seeing it in class, and it was very interesting because she really got the value of putting a strategy into place, and that was the content operations part.
Maybe one other thought. I can subscribe to everything you have said, the three of you. What's quite interesting, I think, in let's say business theory, there is some criticism of the notion of strategy, and there are people who say strategy is maybe not so important or must not be overestimated. There is always a kind of, let's say, performance aspect of business activities, and I think this new accent on content operations is maybe something in parallel to this development on the business side.
That's true as well. I see it, and I see that having some language around it now. And I think because we've got the mental model that businesses can understand. So if I look back at some of my old presentations and articles, and I've mentioned content operations 15 years ago, but it kind of fell flat because it didn't really resonate with anyone's mental model. But now that we have all these other ops, so we've got, DevOps is probably the most common one, but we have design ops and research ops and AI ops, and we've got it for everything. And now when you talk about content ops, there's this kind of quizzical look for a minute, but then the penny drops. And I don't think anyone would have recognized that content was operationalizable. I don't even know if that's a word, but I don't know if people realized it could be operationalized. They just thought of it as this kind of mythical creature that arose from someone's desktop, and it didn't really have that rhythm to it. So that's a welcome change that I've seen. Okay, I'm going to move us along to the next topic, and the next topic is, what are the similarities and differences between marketing and tech comm content strategies? So when you have a content strategy that's around, the kind of the large body of, in the UK, they'd probably call it guidance, and in North America, they'd call it tech comm or technical material. And then you've got on the other side the marketing content strategy, which is focused on campaigns and so on. So Jeff, why don't you go first this time and talk about some of the similarities and differences, and why it's important, or maybe it's not important, maybe we're overthinking it, and just discuss that for a bit.
Sure. So I think that the discussion of mental models is really apt here, because one of the things that I've noticed, at least in my work settings, in different organizations that I travel amongst, is that we're living in a different time now in which the way that marketers think about process. And I think, again, not to harp on this too much, but I do think that the maturation of the tools that marketers, and I'm thinking about integrated marketers, performance marketers, digital marketers, marketers that think about product analytics or product marketing. There's something that they all share, which is a very close eye to process and resilient processes. And I think that this is where the bridge to tech comms expertise starts to arise or become more obvious, which is if you have assets that are highly reusable, that are extensible, that are modular, that are smart, you start to get better hooks into measuring how those assets are used in the wild by a sales team, by different segments, by different kinds of customers, and then these things can get connected to, again, as I mentioned, elements of performance, whether these elements in a knowledge base are actively helping solve a question that's not being solved in a call center, and what we need to do to think about integrating the resources that the call center uses and that the digital customers use in a knowledge base. Now, that might be a poor example, but again, I think when we're thinking about making content resilient and really offering content that really knits together these user flows and these sort of mental models that marketers think of, like a flywheel effect, that you're always, basically bringing in customers as a SaaS, a software as a service type product will do, always looking to onboard new customers, always looking to ingratiate and educate and eventually win the loyalty of new users. The content needs to be there to support every stage of that customer journey, and every stage of that experience gets, I think, more care and attention than it has in the past by marketers. The ones that I'm coming across these days are fundamentally a different breed of professional than they were when I started my career.
Interesting. So do you see, let me call it more of an awareness of the things like metadata and kind of the technical side of things that make content particularly agile? Because I don't see it here, and I don't know if that's if that's just me, or if I'm just not encountering the right people.
Well, I mean, to the person with the hammer, the world is a nail. So I want to sort of lay down that proviso before I say anything more. But I have noticed a lot of people much more receptive and ready to talk about metadata, in part because if we continue to think about marketers specifically, but we could obviously be talking about digital executives and CIOs, CTOs, and so on, is these folks are responsible very often for multiple systems of record. And as soon as you start talking about connective tissue across those systems of record, you're in the land of identifiers, you're in the land of standards, you're in the land of cross-reference tables, you're in the land of both having intact technical metadata and administrative metadata, but then also the importance of carryovers of this descriptive metadata, from a CMS to a DAM to a CRM and so forth. So I just think that because there are increasingly so many different configurations of technology systems that various professionals are responsible for, and sometimes they're responsible for the experience as it's expressed across those systems and not the systems themselves. That's a pretty familiar scenario I see out there. There's just this added attention to detail, and I'm not saying that people are getting it right, but I think they have more of a sense of, oh yeah, actually metadata is the name for the pain point that I know that I need to address.
Okay. Interesting. Heinz, how do you feel about the similarities and differences? Do you agree with Jeff? Or are you seeing something different?
My impression is that maybe the people Jeff has met are a bit ahead of the people we have met, or the people on this side of the pond. My feeling is that most marketers I know, and especially most content marketers, are not very well aware of, let's say, reusability of content as an asset, etc. The only exception may be something like schema.org and this metadata, where they see the advantages for search engine optimization. But in general, I would say they are quite for most of them, I'm not really convinced that they have understood, let's say, the value of structured content, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Anne, I know that you do a number of projects that kind of are on the technical content side, or the tech comm side, but I know that you've also done projects on the marketing side. So what's your take on the similarities and differences? Do you see some sort of kind of a fundamental difference, or are they kind of a strategy is a strategy? It just means it's individualized, like as they tend to be.
Well, as sort of when I was thinking about this question in advance and listening to the different discussion, I mean, one of the things that I have always felt is the difference, and wrote an article for it for the Content Marketing Institute, but it's kind of this, two sides of content strategy, sort of front end, back end. When we think of technical communications, in many ways, the design of the strategy is more technical. So you mentioned metadata, and we're talking metadata for retrieval of content from the SCM, so from a structured content management system, also metadata for delivery, workflow, modeling, reuse strategies, a tremendous amount of focusing on what we need to do to model the content, to support the content so that it can sing and dance as it goes out to our customers. And then from the marketing side, there's I'm not just saying that it's not there on the TechCom side, but on the marketing side, there's a really big focus on the customer and the customer experience. So there's a lot of work done on how it will be presented, interactions, access, that sort of thing, and not quite as much sort of thinking about, well, it's got to go into a content management system. How will we manage it there? What do we have to do to that content in order to generate that experience? Now, I think we're starting to see it come together more as both sides learn more of both aspects, but that's sort of where I see the biggest difference.
That's a yeah, I like that insight. So I'm aware that the panelists aren't really talking to each other. It's all kind of going through me. I don't want this to be where I'm the arbiter. So I'm just the facilitator here. So if you hear something that somebody else is making a point and you want to jump in, please do go ahead and jump in.
Well, I wanted to certainly agree with Heinz and actually say that I do think that there's definitely a gap among marketers in how they think about content. And obviously, it's kind of foolish to generalize broadly. But having said that, I do find that marketing organizations that I've encountered that are very focused on measurement, and obviously this can take many forms. It's not that they're thinking about content in a more sophisticated way. It's that I think that they are, to bring up Ann's point, so much more attentive to the individual gaps or sort of moments of insight that they have now in and around their analysis of the funnel and how they're trying to manage it, that they really do seem to understand that content is the glue of those interactions at the end of the day. So they may not say, oh no, what we really need is better keywords, but they would understand that there's a failure of process here, or there's a failure to model content as effectively as it could be if it was atomized and broken down and then made to fill through a few different use cases, a decision tree for the sales enablement people, you know, a scripted bot answer in a conversational user interface, and on and on and on.
Right. Yeah, Jeff, I agree. They are getting more and more data oriented, and that's maybe the trick, or that's how it gets a bit easier to convince them of the value of a content strategy.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Carry on, please.
What I wanted to, I would like to comment on Ann's point with this distinction on her distinction between front end and back end content strategy. I think it is that's a very important point, but I think it's also necessary, and that may be one of the points of content operation, let's say, to harmonize both sides, and to have and to design the back-end systems in a, let's say, user-oriented way, and to let's say to keep that holistic view of content and content strategy.
Heinz, I totally agree with you that it needs to come together. You can't have a back end without understanding, you know, the user needs and the user experience, and we can't have the kind of quality user experience unless we understand what we need to do with the content in order to support that, to get it there.
I would say, especially in your big book, you have so much about user experience, importance of user experience, etc. It's much more user oriented than most of, let's say, the marketing literature I know. So
that's very funny, because if you go outside of our industry, you know, user experience and marketing, it goes hand in hand, and you never hear about it with tech comm. But you know, Ann's turned the industry on its head.
Well, it's hard to imagine how we can deliver content without thinking about the customer. I mean,
exactly.
And I really do think that knowledge has to be there so that we can deliver what's required, not just what we think is going to support the product.
So I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here, and I'm going to say, when I'm talking to people about content strategy for marketing on the marketing side, there really isn't much discussion about like the operational side, and it's still a lot of the like, let's get in an agency and let's get them to do X, whatever X might be, you know, design the campaign site, or you know, update a certain section, and so the strategy focuses more on, you know, the delivering content and the user experience and so on, but it's not on the kind of maintenance or of care and feeding of that content afterwards. And I had actually one person, when I said, "What's your maintenance plan?" and they looked at me very blankly and went, "Maintenance?" It's just like, no, we put this up and we move on, and then somebody else cleans up behind us, I guess. Like, we don't know and don't really care. Whereas with TechCom, there's so much focus on the actual systematization of content, because you know that 6 months from now there's going to be a new product or a new product line or a new version, and you're going to have to unpick whatever you've done sloppily to be able to reuse everything. So you better just knuckle down and do it in the first place. And so for me, though, that's a huge difference between a marketing strategy and a TechCom strategy. But I'm interested in, you know, like, you can tell me I'm full of it and go jump in the lake. I don't mind. I just want to get your perspective on that.
I think you're right to some extent. I think it is a matter of time scale, and somebody who is hidebound at thinking about campaigns and campaign duration is going to, it's inimical to them to think about, well, there's a tear down after the, it just doesn't come naturally. Their focus and maybe accountable to the performance of a campaign and the idea of a campaign, and that, it can lead to sort of slippery slope. Now, once you have marketers who have some fingertip access to setting up some automations, you have the reverse situation, which is, what if I have always on campaigns that are, I call automations? Who's checking in on those? The interesting thing is, you get some measurements with those systematized user flows, and some organizations are very interested in optimizing, and some are, not. And so you've got a different realm of problem now. But I think what it really highlights is the benefit of technical communicators and their ability to think at different kinds of timescales about the, more resilient, sustainable practices, and not just one and done type thinking.
I like that one and done versus the kind of reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah. What I can maybe add, in the German-speaking countries or in Germany, there are some major content marketing agencies, which are a sort of rebranded corporate publishing agencies. And these agencies used to be very campaign focused. And now I think all of them are trying to become what they are calling full service agencies and focus on the whole, let's say, digital experience. And that's a signal for change, I would say.
Well,
Here.
that's good. Very good. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next topic, which is, and I just want to make sure we're not short on time, but we've got plenty of time, is if we accept that content strategy is, the design of content systems, if you will, then what are the baseline skills for strategists to be effective? And I'm going to ask Heinz to lead on this, because I know that in the program that you're the program director of, and that I teach in, in the interest of transparency, you don't just teach what Ann would call like a back-end strategy or a front-end strategy. You've got this impressive range of topics that goes from everything from kind of branding and content marketing down to the other end of content modeling and some technologies. So can you just talk about how you've set up the program and why you're teaching these skills and why it's important?
Yeah, maybe one small correction. I used to be the program director, but I stepped back, and now I have a successor called Robert Gutonik. You know him, and I hope that I can do some writing now and have some more time for research. But yeah, in our case, when we are in a sort of diaspora. Content strategy is not well known in let's say in Central Europe. So we did this program, let's say, to learn content strategy ourselves, and we always had a holistic view of content strategy. And what we also realized is to put that together, we needed a lot of, let's say, different kinds of knowledge and different kind of experts. And what I see still today, there are not many people who, let's say, have an overview or have this more general skills to bring all these things together. And I see content strategists as people who can, who have an overview, who know which kinds of experts to coordinate for a specific project, a bit maybe like architects. Architects are not designers, they are not engineers, etc. But they have to know a bit about all these different things. And without this knowledge, they cannot work. But let's say their their skills as architects are different from all these fields of knowledge. It's difficult to describe, but for I would say, from the experience we have made, it is not easy. There is no, up until now, there has not been a kind of formation for or education for content strategists, and we are still doing baby steps.
Okay. I'm going to kind of talk about content strategy for just a minute before I turn it over to Jeff and Ann. Is that when I look at the Management Consulting Association or Institute, that content strategy looks a lot like management consulting. You do the same steps at the beginning. You do a discovery, you do a content, a gap analysis, and then you create some sort of a roadmap. And the difference between other management consultants and content strategists that I know is what we do during the discovery and what we do during the gap analysis to do content turnarounds as opposed to financial turnarounds. So whereas somebody might do some sort of very detailed financial analysis, we might do a very detailed content audit, or that's one example. So that's kind of been my take on it, although I know that there are many people who might disagree, but I kind of take comfort from that because it means that what we're doing is focusing on solving problems. And so what we're doing with those, if we're going to turn that into content operations, or we're turning it into campaigns, or whatever we might be doing, we're still focusing on solving a business problem with content. That's our core medium. So Jeff or Ann, do one of you want to talk about what you see as baseline skills for a strategist to be effective?
Well, I agree with what you've said, that we're very much like a management consultant, and understanding, we need to understand the situation and gap analysis and the recommendations associated with that. And then it's like, given that situation and the goals and the objectives of the organization and the needs of the customers, then the content strategist needs to, I believe, have somewhat of an information architecture type bent. So yes, metadata is really, really important, whether it's SEO or content management, that understanding how we can design our content models, how we can structure our content in those content models, how can we provide authoring guidance to authors so that they can effectively write against those models. How can we develop a reuse strategy? So understanding first creation versus reuse. There's just so many different things. There's workflow. How do we manage the content through its life cycle? How do we ensure that we are touching the content on every aspect? And then how are we designing the front end delivery, which might be a little bit more like a user experience person. And it may not be that the person has to be able to do all of these things, but they need to understand all of these things. And they need to, I think, bring into an effective team though the knowledge to optimize, be it the user experience, be it the integration with the technology, so a content engineer, all sorts of aspects. So blending, it's really, I think, a big picture blended role that a content strategist has, and has to have the skill sets to do.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think and it's interesting the way, Rahel, that you framed the question as baseline skills. So I tend to think that the the one great baseline skill is the ability to see a content offering at different altitudes or different levels of abstraction. So at 40,000 feet with content, there's essentially, you know, whatever. There's thought leadership, there's a knowledge base, there's, you know, they're able to think of the portfolio of assets. And then in descents of altitude, able to think about greater levels of detail about the role and the functioning and maintenance of that, of those pieces of the portfolio. So I would say that's a great baseline skill. But what I would also love to call up, and Rahel, you'll forgive me later because you know I can never go talking to you for longer than 10 minutes without saying the word taxonomy. The most pleasant revelation in the last 5 years of my professional life has been really the resurgence of the need for strong information sciences skills among our content professionals. And this is not just because of voice. It's not just because of the rise of personalized experience. I think it's a side effect of a lot of things, even just complexity in organizations and that ability to bucket and think of broader term, narrower term. You know, this is old knowledge, and there's a tremendous wealth of literature people can rely on, like Ann Rockley's work, like Marcia Bates's work from, you know, back in the late 80s, when she talked about berry picking and information retrieval. Everything that might be quote unquote old is new again, and I think it's much more important than it's ever been. Going forward, I think of information sciences work as the emergent sort of domain expertise for content professionals.
Yeah, and Jeff, I would also say they must be curious, and they must be able to understand, let's say, technological developments and see the consequences for content.
That's a very good point.
Rahel, for instance, content ops follows DevOps. And you can talk about that because you know a lot about development and about software engineering, etc. And I think that is essential. And people who have no idea of this technical, let's say, infrastructure and of the speed of development there and the different directions cannot be good content strategists. That's also my experience in our program. We need techies.
I completely agree on that one. There is sometimes I'm told I'm kind of too technical and I focus too much on the you know, quote unquote boring stuff. And I remember the first time I did a content modeling presentation at a conference, and I tried to simplify it a lot, and I was still told I got a bad review because it was too technical. And that was a bit of a shock to find out how, and of course now everybody's talking about content modeling, and you know it's progressed over the years, but at that time it was shocking to me how little people knew. And I thought that my background in tech comm has actually given me an advantage in the non-tech comm world, because when I talk about how to do componentized authoring in a decoupled system from the publishing environment, you know, I've got devs who will say to me, I've been doing this for 10 years. I've never heard of this. It sounds like voodoo. And I'm thinking, well, I've been doing this for a lot longer than 10 years. It's been around. So you need to widen your scope of reading. But if content strategists, so I often say that if you ask someone how they're going to get to the other side of the Atlantic and they don't know that airplanes exist, they're always going to describe a boat. They might describe a rowboat or a speedboat or the Queen Mary, but it's always going to be a boat. And so you have this with a lot of content people who want to be content strategists, but if you don't know that things exist, you're always going to describe better ways to use Microsoft Word. Right? I mean, you're chuckling.
And I'm laughing in the background because it's so true.
Yeah.
So true.
And this, one of my kind of pet peeves is that not enough content strategists go out and decide they're going to learn about these things. So, you know, when I think back in the days even before meetups, I would go, oh, there's a meeting of the Business Analysts Association. Let's go see what they do. And there's a meeting of the, you know, like I learned to do code, and I learned about like all sorts of things in what I would call adjacent professions. And that brought a kind of a richness to my practice. And it's surprising to me as to how many people don't want to bring that richness to their own practice, and then they kind of come up short when they're being challenged with certain questions or certain problems that they can't figure out the technological answer to. So I don't write code, I don't do that, but I know enough about how it works that I think, I bet that can be automated. So those are the kinds of things that I like to see people bring to the table. And this is why I think people from a tech comm background have a distinct advantage, because you can find a lot of people who are doing the editorial side content strategy, but not many others are going to have your depth of knowledge in, particularly if you've used things like help authoring tools or you know, structured frame maker or a component content management system. You have knowledge that is very valuable to other groups that people don't even know exist. And so when you can go up and, you know, kind of quietly and competently say, I can help you with that. I can help you bring down that, you know, 6-week lead time to 2 weeks. You know, it starts to have a different effect. You know, the potential impact and potential, whatever it may be, savings or cost savings or revenue generation opportunities. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that content strategy and tech comm strategy is starting to come back together. I think there was this divergence for a while, and now it's coming back together. Thoughts? Agree, disagree?
Yes, I think that's a beautiful callback to Heinz's point about curiosity too, is seeking out other adjacent domains and places where people are doing work and understand their ways of working as a strategist is a great way about knowing how operations works, because you understand what engineering is expecting of this payload. You can understand what marketing is expecting of this, you know, user flow. You can understand what the business, you know, it goes on. And so I think we're all in very strong agreement, it seems to me.
Yeah, I don't know if you know John Maeda's design and tech report, and he distinguishes 3 types of design. First, the classical industrial designs, Bauhaus design, etc. And then he says there's design thinking. That means to transfer of design principles to business development. And then he says there's computational design. And computational design depends on Moore's law and has rapid cycles of innovation, etc. And the consequences are can be immediately important for millions of people, etc. And I think content strategy is a part of computational design. And it's important to see that. The content systems, Rahel, you are mentioning are part of, are realized by computers.
Huh. So I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's very interesting.
One of the things that you said, Rahel, made me think about another skill set that I think is required, and that's an understanding of change management and organizational change. And so you spoke about Microsoft Word and not realizing that there are other things out there. And one of the things that we need to understand, especially if we're not dealing with a traditional technical communicator who's going to create the content, is the how comfortable they are working with a variety of other tools. We can give them a fantastic template. We can provide a lot of opportunities for creating content and reusing content. And but if we don't understand sort of where the organization is, where the content contributor team is, it can be an extreme challenge to educate people, help them to understand how the job of writing has changed, and how to do it, how to use new tools. It can be really, there can be a lot of pushback if there isn't understanding of
That's very true.
the organizational status.
We have
That's
and in our we are just redoing the curriculum of our program, and we will have a course on change management in the next version, because
Excellent.
yeah, it's simply a result of our experience with many projects.
yeah.
It is, yes. It's so important. I also teach in a different program, Cork Institute of Technology, and I've added in a change management one and process maturity models, because it is so important to understand that you can have the best strategy and the best operational in the world, but if you have not thought about change management, it can fail.
Yes, it's so true. And you know, the longer, I don't know if have any of you ever tried to teach yourself the Dvorak keyboard? No?
Give it up.
Well, I did maybe 7 years ago. I tried because I had such RSI in my wrists, and I thought, you know, we know that the Dvorak keyboard's better for you ergonomically, but my brain had so embedded the QWERTY keyboard that after 2 weeks I was still tapping things out excruciatingly slowly, and I thought, I just can't do this to my client, like to waste all this time just you know, tapping out these things in such an inefficient manner, and I gave up. But I think that we sometimes underestimate the we see it as somebody being stubborn or somebody being resistant, when it really is just something in the brain that's really embedded something, and to change habits is so hard. And it's, you know, even if, as you said, you can give them the best infrastructure and the best tools and the best templates and so on, but if you don't have that that practice that lets you tip the balance from, you know, tapping something out on a keyboard that's really feels you're being very inefficient and it's very painful, to being able to just kind of sail along and your fingers are doing the walking without thinking about it, you're not going to get that adoption. And that's after all of those things that, like, they might send you on training and they'll change your job description and they'll, you know, they'll do all that, those corporate infrastructure things. But unless you can make your in your own personal environment, until you can turn it around, you stand to fail. Someone else say something. Agree or disagree?
Well, I love that there's a lot of thoughtful pragmatism in what you were just saying. You know, you want to learn the Dvorak keyboard, but you don't want to burden your client with the ramp up time that it's going to take. You know, and I think, again, practitioners who are working down at the modular level and the component level with these assets and thinking about their integrity and the versioning and so on, as we move into user experiences that are more and more dynamic, personalized, or automated, there is a new level of attention to detail that is not just going to be a nice to have, but is going to become a legal necessity. And so that's another area where I think we're not too far away from designers and Hippocratic oaths and do no harm, because you know, if you are somebody who understands the importance of these content assets, making these declarations and these transformations of the content being able to be revoked, and that the user can, pass this information back, and then the user experience has to represent a default state and so on. This is really important, non-trivial stuff, and I think that content professionals are really well situated to be thoughtful and yet pragmatic.
Good point. Very good point. Okay, so we're getting close to the top of the hour, so now it's time to open it up to discussion. If anyone has, from the audience, if you have any questions, or if you just want to debate any of the points that we've made, we have another half hour that we can spend doing this. So there is a question box in your control panel, and so you should be able to type your questions there. And in the meantime, we will do a short musical number. Well, just kidding.
I was going to say, Rahel, I think a few questions came in prior to the call. Maybe we could start with some of those. You shared an email exchange while people are putting in their additional questions.
Yes. And let me just find those questions here. So one of the questions was, is it possible to break down silos, or will they always be there because of how companies are organized? And this kind of goes to, the idea of governance and change management. So, Ann, do you want to start us off on that? Is it possible to break down silos?
I've written about that in the book and subsequent editions and called it breaking down silos. But over time, I'm not sure that we can completely eliminate silos. There are reasons that different groups are organized in different ways. But what I think we need to start doing is bridging the silos. So people will, be responsible for X and somebody else is responsible for Y, and therefore they're in a different group. But if we can bridge those silos, so if we can, put a hand out across and start to educate and start to query and start to understand their needs versus your needs, I think we can start to see some success, because different working groups are ingrained in organizations.
That's interesting. I read a Harvard Business Review article on silos, and they kind of agree that silos will always be there, but you can ventilate them, which I thought was an interesting metaphor. So you can kind of, what you're calling bridging, they call ventilating, and it was the idea that you can collaborate and you can find those logical connection points. So one of the ways I could see ventilation or bridging happen is that the putting attributes and elements onto content to make it into an omni-channel experience. If you don't have anyone in kind of the marketing group who knows how to set this up and make it happen, you certainly have that in your TechCom group. So you can offer those services like as an internal service, and then you're starting to exchange ideas about the content at the same time.
Rahel, what I think is we are visiting Facebook once a year with our students, and in London, Mike Everton and his colleagues there, and my impression is within Facebook they do not really have these silos, and I'm very skeptical about Facebook in general, but what they tell about the way they are working with very flexible teams, with a sort of internal networking, etc., I think it's far ahead of what most companies do, and it shows that that is possible even for such a company of these dimensions.
Interesting. Oh, well, we'll have to ask. You'll have to ask that question next time your students visit, and see what the response is.
Yeah,
I don't know much about their internal culture, so I can't comment on that.
Obviously, it can be very stressful for the people working there, because they have no fixed job descriptions and positions, etc., and they have to do networking, etc. But it's one reason why they are so successful and so fast.
Interesting. Okay, that's it's an interesting concept.
I would agree with what Heinz said, and I've run across a number of organizations just in the last couple of years that are organizing increasingly nimbly around pods or squads, highly focused, highly seemingly tactical, but I think there's a good strategic amount of execution in their work. And it's almost feels improvisational because they could rapidly evolve. Now, one thing that I've noticed in those organizations is they have different degenerative conditions, continuity of practice for a UX writer that's assigned to this pod as the UX writers in other pods could be in jeopardy. And so some of this bridge building, I think, is still incredibly important, as Ann brought up. And I'll just mention taxonomy one more time. I think that right now there's not just a vogue for taxonomy, but a vogue for crosswalks. So how will we link these systems? Not go back to the bad old days of thinking we need to have one schema to rule them all, or one set, one vocabulary or one data set, but rather, how can we get these things to start interacting and talking to one another? And then you start to create some economic incentives across silos to share systems of record, or to have aligned purposes around maintenance. And again, this all gets back to operations.
Right. Oh, that's a very good point. Very good point. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in here. The first one is, with the variety of terminology on roles and functions, how should we brand ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Good question. How should we brand ourselves?
Is not content strategist an effective term? I mean, I'm thinking over all the years that we have spent, building up an understanding of what that means and the acceptance of what that means across multiple content areas. I don't know. I like that term.
I like it too, and it's very good to hear that from you.
So I'm thinking maybe maybe the question actually is, how you talked about front end and back end content strategists. Maybe this is the back end content strategist. I brand myself as a strategist that creates content systems, and I do content operations to distinguish myself from the content strategist who does brand and editorial. So, that could be like a small distinction, like what kind of doctor are you? And you could be anything from a psychiatrist to a podiatrist, and, unless you actually specify. So maybe this is the distinction of what kind of a content strategist are you? So I would go with that, in that really just kind of spell out what your sweet spot is, because we all have different sweet spots.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea in terms of differentiating. But I would stick with the overall term of content strategist, and as you say, articulate where your strengths are. So marketing content strategist, product content strategist, tech comm product strategist. There is another term, content engineer, which is really a content person with a very strong technical area of expertise for building the actual technology and configuring that. There's a variety of different flavors that I think we could certainly talk about.
What's happening here, anyways, is that content strategy, like if you look at the ads for content strategists, it's they want somebody who can plan and write. So they're the term content strategy is starting to devalue when they're expecting you to do writing as well. And and I've gotten into trouble talking about the difference between a strategist and like the person who does the planning and the person who does the execution. I say sometimes if you're in a small organization, yes, you do it all, but this part of it is the strategy part, and that part is the execution part of the strategy. So I know in different markets there are different ways of talking about these things, so I don't want to overgeneralize, but in some cases people have stopped calling themselves content strategists because of that kind of co-option by the marketing industry.
And I think that's a valid point, particularly if people are trying to espouse a certain subject matter expertise or a certain area of passion or where they're deeper. And I've certainly noticed, you know, I was lucky to be invited to a panel late last year, and it was nominally a group of people that I would have thought were self-identified as content strategists, yet I would say a good, you know, 90% of the room identified as a content designer. This is in New York City, and this is something that I couldn't imagine happening 5 years ago. And I think, again, these are byproducts of how content work is being done out in certain kinds of companies. And, you know, it does sort of rear the head of the front end versus back end conversation. But I think it's also bigger than that. And I think ultimately, looking at all the nomenclature debates over the years in user experience, it strikes me that the profession, many digital professions are not so great at defining themselves, because we in fact operate in a slipstream and these things are evolving all the time. So I am also leery of identifying too closely with any of these monikers.
Well, I'm going to add something in, and that is that the UK government publishes on the website what a content designer is and what a content designer does. And it's a very well-established job description in the UK, and I would call it like the UX of content, right? And you take a piece of content and you strip it all down and you kind of go, what are they really trying to say here? And then you might say, oh, actually, this needs a little bit of a wizard. Let's build a wizard and show people, you know, in progression where we ask them a question, yes, no, and you know, it's like driver's license. Are you under this age or over that age? And that gives you a different set of instructions. Or you break it down with more headings and so on, and you'd go, well, that's what a tech writer does. And yeah, it's very much the same as a tech writer, but it's called a content designer, and now there's starting to be this cross-pollination. So a woman named Sarah Richards, who used to work for the government in content design, she's been going to places like Confab, and she's been talking about content design. And I think that the people who are actually interested in the UX of content are going to gravitate towards that title because that reflects more of what they do. So it's kind of an interesting cross-pollination here. I would like to go on to the next question because we've got 2 or 3 questions. I want to make sure we get them all in. Someone's asked, you talked a bit about essential skills necessary for content strategy. What do you foresee being the answer to that question 5 years from now? Ooh. Okay, I'm hearing a lot of static in the line, so if somebody is somebody right then. Okay.
It's very.
Heinz,
I think it is very difficult to say that. I would still say computational skills are important. What we maybe did discuss enough is the ability to coordinate people, to explain things, to translate things to people, etc. That will for sure be even more important 4 years from now. But when we started our program 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't really know about content marketing. I must confess that. And so to say what will be important in 5 years, content operations is also, Rahel, you are talking about that since 15 years, but it became, I think, well known since 1 or 2 years. Content design is the same story. So it's really difficult to forecast if something's there.
Good point. And Jeff, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I was thinking that what we have is a difference between skills and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe the skills that someone has today, or what we're suggesting that someone has today, are probably going to be the skills of for 5 years down the road, but the knowledge and the way that they apply those skills may change. So technology may change over time. The types of content we deliver over time may change. But I think the methodologies that we use, so as you spoke about, the analytic, so the analysis in the beginning and the gap analysis, the design work, whether we're modeling for a help file versus, modeling for a chatbot, modeling for a web page. Modeling is modeling is modeling. Yes, we may adapt it to something new in the future, but the skill set for modeling, being able to look at structure, being able to look at organization, to be able to look at granularity, I don't think those change. And I have my own experience. So I wrote the first edition of the book, Managing Enterprise Content, a Unified Content Strategy. I wrote that, and it was published in 2002, and then it was revised in 2012. And it hadn't changed a lot. Yes, I added in a whole bunch of new stuff, but the basics of the methodology remained the same. So I think the skill sets will endure, but the knowledge and the way that we apply it will change.
Interesting. Yes, I can see that. That kind of goes back to what Jeff said about everything that was old is new again. And I see these cycles happen. And so you're absolutely right in that you can have this kind of same old, but it's new and it's taken on a different luster, and it's, it's maybe a different coat of paint, but it's still pretty current.
May I add one thing? I totally agree with what you said. But one experience we made with our program, or I think we made, is we undervalued or underestimated the importance of search, of search engines as Google, etc. Also of search in databases, etc. And taxonomies are important topic there. But I think there is a lot of good of knowledge about search. There's also a lot of snake oil, but there is a lot of really well-established knowledge. And if you want to speak reasonably about digital content, I think it's very important to get accustomed to this knowledge.
I would
James
add to
Wattenbrink, for
that.
instance, James Wattenbrink is a very important person in this field.
I would add to what you said, Heinz, in that if somebody says they're a digital content manager, the only difference between digital content and non-digital content is metadata. So if you don't know about writing a search engine result, or the importance of having 2 or 3 titles potentially, or putting semantics on your content, then how can you be a digital content manager? Okay, the next question, in an organization where there is no tech comm group and writers report to different groups, how can a content strategy be developed and implemented across the organization? And I'll go first on this one because I have quite strong opinions on that. And I would say that a content strategy is not a departmental initiative. It is an organizational change. And so it shouldn't be parked in a department. So even if you did have a TechCom group, it shouldn't be a TechCom strategy. It's an organization's content strategy. And the projects that are successful is when there's a recognition at a cross-department level that a strategy is needed, and you have an executive sponsor who will go to their peers and manage the expectations at the C-level or at whatever levels appropriate in your organization, but definitely not as a departmental strategy, because it's too small. Then you're just doing a TechCom content strategy as opposed to a content strategy. And I've been known to say that even if you are asked to do a social media strategy, then you have to think about all the content, because a lot of social media strategies end up being pointing to articles in a knowledge base. So if you don't have a knowledge base strategy, then how can you have something to point to? So you can see where different kinds of content connect together. And so when you start a content strategy by saying, what do we have to deal with? Like, what's all of our content? It's almost like the Marie Kondo method, right? Put all your clothes in a pile on the bed, and now we're going to find out what brings you joy. And so we kind of choose a content version of that. It's like, show me what you've got, show me everything you've got, and now we're going to figure out what we're concentrating on and what we're going to fix. But now that we know all this other stuff is out there and what the connection points are, we can actually use them to our advantage. So I hope that's helpful. Is anyone else got strong opinions on this?
Well, I think you're just about right there. I do think that it helps in the absence of having a group to align resources around how they do their job consistently. There are artifacts, right? And one of the things that I think is ascendant in a lot of organizations that have a very strong commitment to user experience design is the rise of design systems. And so we've seen a lot of this percolating. And I think that for content professionals, this is an opportunity to revisit artifacts such as the style guide and to update it for componentized levels of depth and detail that will be applicable not just to the continuity of their practice, but their colleagues in engineering, in product and design, so on, so forth. And so I think that there's just this, again, these are handholds, these are crosswalks, these are ways in which professionals who think about content closely and thoughtfully can articulate and express the thinking of a strategy down at the level of these operational tools. And I, have one client that I noticed has done a great job of interpreting their design system down to the level of very, very small components, and then doing the thinking around the content aspects of that, not just word count, but other attributes, whether they're administrative or descriptive and so forth.
Right. No, good. Okay, next question. Can you talk about new people entering the content management or content strategy community and the best resources on a budget for them? I'm only 2+ years into content management world from another silo. Hold on a minute, I'm having a hard trouble reading this. From another silo at our company, came from another department, and am really now just starting to get into some of the resources out there. Sometimes the resources can be overwhelming when first starting, and where to start from.
Yeah, there are some good books.
There's some good books.
By Rahel Bailie and Ann Rockley, for example. That's a good start.
Oh, smooth, Heinz, smooth. Okay, so Heinz, is your Zotero, is that open to the public?
No, we have closed that because we are using it also as a repository for our project work. But
okay.
we can publish the list. We can publish the bibliography. But maybe that is also overwhelming. We have 1,500 titles in it now.
Okay.
But I would still say there are some excellent books. There's also the book by Mike Atherton and Carrie Hain. I think that then the books by James Matthewson are excellent. I would also recommend Halvorson's book. And then there is this short introduction by Erin Kisane, The Elements of Content Strategy.
Yes, that
was the first book I ever read about content strategy, and I still think it's a good introduction.
I agree. That's a very good one. So that's a good place to start. And I agree that instead of going into the kind of the whole, jumping into the deep end, then it's good to start with something like Mike Atherton's Connected Content, and those kinds of, or James Matthewson's book, Outside in Marketing, because it really is just kind of, it's a content strategy book without really using the term content strategy. Somebody asked, what's the difference between a content strategist and an information designer?
Well, again, here we have the nomenclature challenges. This is like big IA and little IA to some degree, and those old debates about how people self-describe. I think a lot of this just comes down to sector by sector and organization by organization, almost tribal ways of defining certain roles.
Good answer. I like that. Someone else asks, isn't there some value for the strategist to have some familiarity with the implementation?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely. If you don't understand the implementation, you don't have to do it yourself. But I think you said this earlier, Rahel, that you need to understand what the options are. You need to understand what the opportunities are, and what going back from those opportunities and options, how does that impact your content? What are you going to need to do with your content in order to support that? It doesn't mean you have to be able to actually, code or program or whatever it has to be, but understanding it and the requirements that are then placed on the content. I think that's super important.
Yes, I completely agree. There is another question here that's kind of related to this. I'm going to read it out and then come back to you, because it says that content guru can combine both strategy and pragmatism while getting the work done. And it's if you're in-house and you are in a small company, you can do both. You may not have a dedicated strategist. You've got a strategist, and you're supposed to be able to carry out the strategy. But then, when people like you, Ann, or you, Jeff, or me, or Heinz, like any one of us here, they don't hire us to come in and do the writing or carry it out. I mean, we need to know how to do it, but sometimes they'll hire you for the discovery phase, and they take your roadmap and they go, thank you very much, here's your check, and then they put it in the drawer. Now, what they do with it afterwards, it won't do them much good unless they actually do something with it. But sometimes you're not engaged to do that part. And I find that personally very frustrating. What about you folks?
It's pretty frustrating, and it's hard to understand why a company would do that other than, maybe budget. But it's interesting. I've given companies a strategy and things like that, and then I get called back a couple of years later, and it's like, well, we did this and we did that, or we didn't do this or we didn't do that, and it's not working, or we're experiencing these problems. So they don't see the big picture. But then as consultants, I think we have a different role. We know the whole picture, and we can guide people through the whole picture. I think when you're in-house, doing one piece or another, being, at one point you're a strategist, next point potentially you're a writer, potentially you're a configure, all those sorts of things. I think you just wear many hats in-house, and need to think, switching those hats, but making sure that one hat doesn't interfere with the other, that there's, again, the understanding of the handoffs, I think, are important.
Yeah. Very good point, yes. There's one last question, and I'd like to get to it. We are coming up to the bottom of the hour, so I want to do this before we wrap up. But I think it's very apropos to go out on this note. How do you see content strategy changing as we get further into artificial intelligence?
I'll speak to that one. I've been on a number of projects like that, and if your content is previously structured, it's going to make it easier for AI. But one of my concerns, and it's all the concerns we see as we go forward, is that there is the potential that content and content strategy may no longer be necessary, at least from the perspective of AI, because it begins to create on its own. And I think we need to have controls and standards and quality and all sorts of things in place, that even if the words aren't being written by people like us or designed by people like us in the future, that there's an understanding of what has to come out the other end and the quality of that content. So,
well said. Well said. The best line ever was this past week when I was at a conference for, it's called Information Energy, and it's all about delivering content into complex systems. And someone said, really, AR, they were talking about augmented reality, AR, it's just another channel. And the way they kind of deflated the whole mystery voodoo into it's just another channel. If your content is well marked up and taxonomy, Jeff, jump in, taxonomy. If it's well marked up, then you're just going to deliver the content into this new channel in an appropriate way, to have a good user experience. And I thought that was just beautiful. So we're right at the end now, 7:29. So I want to thank my panelists, Jeff MacIntyre, Ann Rockley, Heinz Wittenbrink. You've been marvelous, and thank you for all your great questions, audience members. That was interesting to see what your concerns and questions are about. And thank you for STC for having us. And Claudia, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panel, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. I will be sending an email with a link to the survey and to the recording of this webinar. So thank you all again, and have a great day.
Thank you.